Today we have Mr. Sujeev Shakya with us, who will be speaking on understanding Nepal, understanding opportunities. Sujeev is the chair of the NEF, Chief Executive Officer of Bead Management and Senior Advisor for Boer Group Asia. He is also concurrently non-resident senior fellow at the ISAS. He is author of 2 books, Unleashing the Vajra, Nepal's Journey Between India and China, and Unleashing Nepal, Past, Present, and Future of Nepali Economy. He also writes a fortnightly column for the Kathmandu Post titled The Other View. Sujeev, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
He will make presentation for 20-25 minutes, followed by the question and answer session.
Yeah, thank you, Amit. Thank you. It's good to be back at NUS ISAS. I remember this is the last place I spoke 3 years ago before, the world was turned, sort of topsy-turvy. I remember that's the time when we were just learning to use hand sanitizers and how to get tested before you come for events, and there was social distancing, so I think there were not more than 10 people allowed in this room. So it's good to be back to Singapore and to ISAS, and I've really enjoyed being part of this amazing institution, collaborating on different pieces of work. It was great to have Iqbal in Kathmandu in November for the Kantipur conclave that we curate, and Harnik writing a piece for us for our flagship publication, NEF-BGA. So I thought today I'll just spend some time, about 20-25 minutes, to just give a perspective. I see, on where do I come from, what the sort of work I do. So, when I say things, why do I say it? So then a bit of talking about Nepal's journey of 15 years, because whenever we are looking at a country, and especially like Nepal, in South Asia, when we talk about South Asia, India and Pakistan dominate the discourse, and very little is discussed. And suddenly, the only thing you can hear is that, oh, China's influence has increased in Nepal, or so those are the sort of remarks, even in public policy seminars. Those are the type of things. So I just thought it'd be good to talk about the last 15 years, and I talk about 15 years because 2006 we had. 2006 we were. We went through a major transition from being a country governed by the Shah Kings for 240 years and then becoming a federal republic. So, and we also got a publication that's coming in looking at those 15 years, what has changed, what has not changed, and what needs to be changed. So from that perspective, we're just going to talk about 15 years. Also want to talk about peaceful transitions, because whenever we are talking about Nepal, we just tend to forget that we have gone through a lot of things, and it's been very peaceful transitions to whatever has happened. A bit on the recent elections, and then, of course, talking about opportunities. So coming from my work, as I was introduced, I worked in the corporate world for nearly 20 years. I was with, formerly with the royal family-owned investment company for Solti Group for about 18 years. We split and then formed another group with one of the family members. Then I'm on my own for the past 15 years. So I come from a very strong corporate background, and then now run a consulting firm and also associated with Bauer Group Asia, a strategic consulting firm. And happy to have Charlie Bauer, Vice President Client Services here. And this is our first collaborative effort, also bringing in Bauer Group Asia, apart from Nepal Economic Forum, to this discussions. What gives me joy is working on Nepal Economic Forum. It's great to be collaborating with ISAS and the publications we do, and we are already discussing collaborations around the upcoming Himalaya Future Forum that Nepal Economic Forum is going to host. I write, work on leadership coaching. So when we look at Nepal's journey of 15 years, just from the last week, I just want to bring about 3, sort of anecdotal stuff that gives us a perspective to understand where the journey has moved. So last week I was in a place called Surkhet it's in the Karnali province, very close to the western Himalaya, the Indian side border. And I was talking to the Surkhet when I went in 2013. There were about 300 broadband connections. Currently, just one company has 10,000 connections. 2023, which means so we about 15,000 households connected to broadband internet, which means 60,000 individuals. So this is like we are talking about a small city or town which is graduating into a city. Similarly, we were doing an event with the British Embassy and talking about hydropower, which has discussed so much about Nepal's potential. And so 15 years ago, when we used to discuss hydropower, it was about an energy-starved Nepal that was starting to reel under power cuts. We went at peak in 2017, about 16 hours of power cut a day. And so from producing to, sort of meet demands and shortages, now we are talking about surplus and already about 10,000 megawatts signed in, developed. And so in another couple of years, we are now energy surplus now. It's about a country that has got a lot of energy trying to navigate how does it sell to India, how does it sell to Bangladesh. So that's the sort of thing. The third is that, again, 2013, 12, when we were doing a project in a place called Gorai, when I was trying to send my team, we have 60% of my team members are women. So when you're saying, so we were trying to find a hotel they could stay in. And the sort of guidance was that they should stay in a hotel where the toilet should not be more than a 5-minute walk. That was the benchmark we had. From there, we have now hotels that are as good as a 3-star, business hotel with, sort of the smell of Americano and cappuccino, the coffee, strong coffee as, coming in as you walk in. So that's the sort of transformation that has happened. And it's very important we see is to understand this transformation of the changes that have happened across. And I'll talk about a bit more as we talk about changes. So there has been tremendous transformation. And the transformation, we need to also understand that 1996 to 2006, we were under 10 years of insurgency. 14,000 lives were lost. We cannot forget that. More than hundreds and thousands of Nepalis were displaced. New towns and cities came up of people who were being displaced, moving into newer areas. Then it took us nearly 10 years to write a constitution. At times, people used to say that we'll never be able to write a constitution. We'll get into protracted, sort of conflicts because while Nepal is 30 million people, small compared to its neighbors, it's also got about 120 plus ethnic groups. That makes the entire inclusion discourse very complicated, especially when we have a large population of people in the Madhes who are different than people, the Tarai or the flatlands who are different than the people in the hills. And there's been a lot of struggle for political inclusion of those people, and so that continues. We also need to understand the peaceful transition from the perspective that the army is integrated very well. Like when we do some work with the Nepal Army Welfare Fund, and when we talk to them, when I talk to the generals to say that, can you distinguish people who have been integrated from the rebel army and people, sort of from your local regular recruits? They cannot. It's been integrated in such a, it's very, very, in terms of, from that perspective, it's something that can be a great example of how integration then takes place when the insurgencies have happened. We move on to federalism. From a unitary government. In between, we had strong autocratic governments. We now have 753 local governments with 7 provinces, so 3 tiers of government, but the federalism has always been questioned. And I think I borrow from what my friend Arniko Pandey, who's currently associated with the Rashtriya Swatantra Party, says, is that when you have a 3-storied house and the middle story, there's a problem there, you don't bring down the house. You basically repair and you sort of fix that. So federalism will be fixed, and we see that the devolution of power that has taken place since the new constitution Nepal had in 2015, there has been tremendous sort of empowerment at the local levels in terms of decision making, and that, and also the building of local businesses, local entrepreneurial pursuits. So that's something that we have seen a lot happening. Again, we talk about resilient Nepalis in terms of, we went through 2015, we had a major earthquake, as we, sort of, like yesterday as I was seeing pictures coming in from Turkey and Syria, it was reminding me of, sort of what happened in Nepal 8 years ago, April 20. We lost nearly 10,000 lives, and a lot of people who were impacted by the earthquake currently still are reeling this. And then just after that, we had a blockade, which not only created economic hardships, but it created a major challenge on bilateral relations with India. So then we were recovering from earthquake blockade, and then COVID happens. But then the good thing is that we have recovered from COVID pretty well than we would, when with other countries. If you look at from a statistics perspective, economic. There were issues around sort of comparing Nepal to Sri Lanka, and this is basically more of a sort of discussions that takes place with very little information. But then we've come up the balance of positive payments is positive. The tax GDP ratio remains at highest in South Asia. There has been domestic tourism has really increased. So tourism, the international tourism is about now 40% of our total tourism. Apart from the big trekking stuff, domestic tourism kept the hotels going, kept the travel services going. And also what we need to, I think, especially it's very applicable to South Asia, generally, even a thing like COVID does not really bring down social spending. So when I go to weddings and I go to birthday parties of kids, or we have multiple functions from birth to death. There are so many rituals, and when we look at those social functions, we don't see the spending coming down. And which I think from our work we do in Africa, we've seen. Like I know my team members in Africa tell me that we've gone vegetarian, because to save some money. So that doesn't happen in Nepal. So the social spending continues. So that's just sort of giving a perspective on to look at the transitioning and the resilience of Nepalis. Come to the third point is on the elections. So we just went through the elections, and I would be more than happy to take questions and specific questions. So the elections began with a very deep resentment against this bunch of 8, 10, sort of male leaders who have been donning the political limelight for past 25 years. And there's a campaign called No, Not Again, and that did have an impact. We have also seen the protracted, intra-party fights across all the political parties that led to the past 5 years the parliamentarians didn't change, but the government changed. And since July 2019, we have not had any major pieces of legislation go through. So now from a doing business perspective, I think that's a huge issue that concerns us in terms of things not moving. Now it's going to become July, it's going to be 4 years that you've got, currently there are about 57 pieces of legislation stuck in the parliament. And that is what, we had this people come out on this No Not Again campaign. We had new forces come up, and there was dissent in the existing political parties. And if you see a lot of new faces that have come up. Also, the elections have been peaceful. And I think compared to, like whenever we say elections in South Asia, it's, associated with violence, booth rigging, all that. And apart from, and some of our friends in international tech platforms and international agencies are pretty surprised to see how peaceful the elections were. There was no, violence. There was no burning down of election, polling booths and others. So it was, and I think it's very important to ensure that these elections are peaceful. I mean, if you look at democracies across, especially in Africa, when you look at, election results get stalled for months. From that perspective, this has been the transition. We have also seen the rise of young leaders. The current parliament, half of them are new faces in the parliament, and in the local elections we had in May, 81% of the people who have been elected are new faces. So there are more younger people. So current parliament, we do see people with backgrounds like, we've people got, MIT grads, worked in Boston Consulting Group sort of thing, come and join the parliament. So we've seen it's a stark departure from the past. We also have extreme groups coming together, like the last coalition, which is the current coalition, comprises of independent parties who are completely anti-monarchy, the religious groupings. Two, you have royalists who want the king back. They have come together in this coalition, which also shows that the politics in Nepal has been about conveniences to stay in power rather than any major ideological issue. Day before, in one of the briefings I was doing with an international community, they were asking me, what's the difference between the political parties in terms of ideologies? And I said, it's very common. Grab power, make some money, move to the next elections. In that way, they're very, there's a sense of consensus on that. One of the things this election also showed is that the fading of the Madhes parties, which is also an area of concern, because if you look at Madhes, which is as I said, the lower flatlands with has a lot of people from the Indian origin. Some of them by default became Nepal because of the 1815 treaty, where parts of Nepal, like Darjeeling to Kumaon, was given in return for some of these flatlands. And those people have always been considered outsiders. And there was a big uprising that cost a lot of lives, and especially in 2017. And we had some of these Madhes parties come together to fight for their cause. The Constitutional Assembly was amended to include this. But this year, again, it's like the politics that we see in next door in Bihar, UP, where there's a personality-driven, lot of intra-party faction. There are currently more than 30 Madhes parties. So that has sort of faded, and that is an area of concern, because there was this, voice is so important as we look at inclusivity in the constitution, as we look at rights of Nepalis across Nepal in the constitution. So this is a thing. Also, I think when I remember writing about the upcoming elections in November, in August, and the only thing I just hoped for was that we'll have 10, 15, well-educated people who can articulate well in the parliament. Because we've seen across democracies in South Asia that having one or two parliamentarians, irrespective of whichever party they belong to, they coming up and speaking for 3 minutes can really make a difference. And we are seeing we've seen this in majoritarian parliaments across, during the times in India, we're looking up to when during the Congress regime, used to have Atal Bihari Vajpayee speaking out. Now, the current parliament, we have some people who speak out. So that was the hope we're having, and we do have. I'm very happy to see that as the parliamentary proceedings are moving. So we had this young parliamentarian, Sumana Shrestha, question the parliament on parliamentary calendar. There should be a calendar for the parliament. Nobody had raised this issue earlier, and she had her 3 minutes, but then that was something that was, became, and today in the days of social media, these things get viral. So that's something that is, that is something that we are hoping would bring about the necessary transformation that we talk about. When we talk about opportunities, I'll quickly go through. I think two fundamental issues we need to continue to remember about Nepal is that two big activities around the economy does not form part of the GDP. One is real estate. 86% of Nepalis own land. So even if you during COVID, that was your shock absorber, you went back to your villages, you were tilling for rice or whatever vegetables. So you have that as a big social security. And trading in land continues. We see that, as I was in Surkhet, Nangari, I just finished this trip, and the land prices there as expensive as Kathmandu. So we see, and also it's a psychological stuff that people who have money, they do buy land. There are a lot of studies. We've commissioned some studies with John Lang LaSalle in terms of to say why do these people buy land. So that's important to understand that there's a cultural dimension to it, there are religious dimensions to it. The second is remittances. Remittances continue to grow, and Nepalis have been migrating from 6th century, so it's not a new phenomena. And we'll see that. And this year we've seen, 2022, we saw a record growth. The last remittance study we did, very clearly $7.5 billion is what comes in formally, and another $7.5 billion that comes in formally. And we see that growing the first 6 months of the fiscal year. Nepali fiscal year is from July to July. So the first 6 months we've seen about 19% growth in remittances. And I think, when the pandemic began, there was this World Bank report that came in and says, oh, remittance is going to dip. And I remember writing a piece for NUS ISAS to say that remittance is not going to dip because somebody sitting in UAE is not going to drive a Ferrari to go and work as a waiter in a restaurant. It's never going to happen. They're not going to start washing dishes. So there is this whole sort of people. And so also there's this intensity when Nepalis wanting to go out. So there is a diversity visa, the US diversity visa that takes 50,000 people from around the world. Nepal, Kathmandu is the #1 processing center. 1 million applications are nearly processed. So which means 1 out of 5 eligible Nepalis apply for this diversity visa in India. So if you look at Korea, there's this government-to-government arrangement on migration to Korea for work. About 1 million Nepalis have taken a Korean language test. Now, it's neither, related to your, sort of nothing close to Nepali, nothing close to any of the languages you know. So it spends a lot on also people going out to study. So for the US, we are #2 after Taiwan per capita students in the US. And if you look at Australia in 2018, Nepalis spent $1.6 billion of private money to send about 60,000 students to Australia. So if you look at the difference, and especially people coming from other parts of South Asia, I tell them that, like when you drive a cab, you are in a cab in Dhaka or in Delhi or in Mumbai, you don't see their aspiration of their children studying in UK or Australia. But in Nepal, you go to Pokhara or Kathmandu and you start having conversations, and they'll say, oh, my one daughter is in Australia and my son will go to UK. So there's an aspiration of going out and working is tremendous, and that's where we see migration and migration leading to remittances. The second opportunity definitely is on being land-linked and the taking away from the whole narrative on landlocked. We've already started seeing as the tourism, it's like I was driving through Pokhara and other places, we see a lot of Indian license plate vehicles in Nepal. The infrastructure in India has improved dramatically around the borders. So people are coming in for spending the weekend. There are lots of religious places. So we are seeing that, and as China opens, we are going to see more. I mean, between India and China, 150 million outbound tourists. Even if we look at 1% of that, that's 1.5 million. Trade along Indian border never has reduced, it's only increased, and I have always been a proponent of border economic zones, especially using the BBIN platform, the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal platform. So I've sort of been continuously writing, propagating as to how do you create border economic zones. There have been some experiments between India and Bangladesh that have worked, and we can say that can be scaled up, especially now digital platforms are possible, digital payment platforms are possible, security through digital means is possible so that you don't have, security challenges. Along China also, we are seeing roads coming up in north, and as we go into Mansarovar area, so this time from Surkhet, we are looking at the 5 routes that can open up to China. We are already seeing a lot of infrastructure building taking place in China, and we would see the connectivity increasing only. So which means Nepal can, as I continuously say, can be the link between India and China in terms of be it rail or be it roads. BBIN connectivity is moving, I think, despite all the challenges. After Prime Minister Modi visited in for the SAARC summit, as SAARC we see as not moving anywhere, so BBIN, multimodal transport agreement came in. So CUTS is leading those studies, so we have been part of it for now 7 years, I would say. And a lot from transport, we moved to multimodal. We are now looking at energy, and which is a big interest for Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, in terms of bringing up an energy connectivity market. And there is definitely interest from the US on this. The Millennium Challenge Corporation grant, that is, the $500 million grant for Nepal, does look at US involvement in building these transmission networks and all. So, which also means if there is energy, there's also opportunity for large investments to look at how can now, say, automobile assembly plants can take this, where you are consuming 300, 400 megawatts of power. So that's the new, and again, for India market, for Bangladesh market. So those are things that are increasing. The third thing we definitely need to look at is on demographics and entrepreneurship. Again, looking back at 15 years, the important thing to really realize is that Nepalis are realizing that we are not a small country, and I think I've been campaigning for this also. So if we were in EU, we would have been the 5th largest populated country, so we are not small. And the demographics is that 50% are under 25, 70% under 40. So which means it's a fertile, so for, be it for skills, be it for market. And if we see in the ICT sector, and it just, that 800 firms now contribute about 37% of our exports. And you have people like yourself who's, doing Singapore, Nepal. There are people who are doing Australia, Nepal, US, Nepal, so a lot of tech firms. And then we see that the symbolism, the visual of this demographics growth and transformation, I say, is in the coffee shops in Kathmandu, where you see that, and outside Kathmandu, where you're seeing this, sort of young people coming together, doing things, many startups. Of course, there are successes, there are failures, but that's the sense of entrepreneurship has changed. There's digital transformation has been a huge thing, and especially COVID only accelerated it. I remember when I was doing one of these, sort of moderating an event, the local Alibaba affiliate was saying that pre-pandemic digital payments was 10% of what they were selling, and now it's about 50%. TikTok consumes about 30% of Nepal's internet bandwidth, and it has been asked to degrade its quality several times, and that's the sort of, and so TikTok is not only just putting up videos of you dancing, but it's also where people are selling products, selling services, doctors are using it, there are people, who are doing art, craft, using it. So that's, and finally, one of the key transformations that migration has also brought about is about this Nepalis being in 180 countries. And like, as an example, I say there's this Nepali rock band, Nepatya, currently in a tour in Australia, and they are doing 8 events in 1 month, and each of these events are seeing 2,000-3,000 people. I mean, which you could not have imagined 20 years ago, and the ticket pricing earlier used to be like, for $5 used to be, and now you're getting premium ticket pricing, and there are people who are, sort of willing to host these shows, and so it's amazing how that's changing. So what I call is the emergence of the global Nepali. So finally, what the conclusions sort of I want to draw from this, and before we open for discussions, is that one is that we need to look at from new lens of opportunities. I think I remember sort of one of my friends was talking about economic crisis, and we were sitting together, and then sort of he was sipping single malt whiskey, and he was talking about economic crisis. And I said, if there was economic crisis, then we would be queuing for fuel and food, not drinking single malt whiskey here, guys. Okay, so it's about how you look at crisis, and of course there's media really at times sort of blows it out of proportion. Also, we need to look at small things like Nepal's banking industry is 2x the size of the Bangladesh banking industry, while we are 1/5 of the population. So there are so many of these indicators that show how the size of the economy, a 40 billion economy. As a country, and especially Kathmandu as a city, I always say is a cosmopolitan capital of South Asia, and also a neutral venue for a lot of South Asian countries, and we are starting to see a lot of regional events happening. Nepal also has the opportunity to lead on climate change, take on leadership, because being the most fragile among, sort of in the Himalayan area. So there's that opportunity, and, be it on now the new areas on green hydrogen or some of these things we're talking about. And definitely one of the things that we would be collaborating, as we discussed before, is on the Himalaya Future Forum, where NUS, ISAS-NEF, and some of the regional institutions are going to work on. And I think the key is also to go beyond the India-China narrative. So when we talk about South Asia, it's also China and India. When you talk about Nepal, it's India and China. And that's why I've been, very happy, this, sort of the partnership we've built with NUS ISAS to have other countries to look at, sort of Nepal. And it's not just backyard for India and China. There are others also. And also to have more younger people interested in this, in Nepal, rather than, sort of there's a set people who are talking about Nepal. So of course, I think we are in between the two fastest growing economies. So if you look at IMF report this year, it's 5.1 and 6.2 is what the two countries, India and China, is going to grow. So we just need to hitch our wagons. The analogy I give is that when you have two rich neighbors putting up nice street lights, if you have a house, you don't have to put up a street light. That's going to brighten your your driveway. I think that's it. So India and China growing means Nepal benefits tremendously. So I think at the end is that it's all about looking at not only about talking about opportunity, but about demonstrating about it. And I think when I look back 3 decades in Nepal, and especially the last 15 years, working with different hats on, I think there's a lot we've been able to do. And I think that's also, I always say, is that it's not about just talking about opportunities, but also being able to leverage it and to really demonstrate it and to show that, yes, Nepal has opportunities. It's only that we need to use a different set of lenses to look at Nepal. Thank you. I just took 30 minutes, it looks like.
Thank you, Sujit, for giving us insightful talk, ranging from politics to economics to climate change, and also covering a bit of geostrategy. Before I open the floor, I would like to ask 2 questions. First is, U.S. is growing importance in Nepal's politics, especially if you look at the entire old narratives, India, China. But now, Samantha Power, USAID administrator, she was there. Then Afreen Akhtar, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, she's due to visit in last week of Feb or mid-Feb. So how you look at this? And then second, what's on ground this Agniveer scheme which was introduced by India? Because large number of Gorkha soldiers, they used to go, it's a traditionally, and they go and join Indian army. So how you look at the Agniveer on the ground? Because we have heard lots of statements coming from Kathmandu, but we don't know exactly that what's going on the ground.
Thanks. I think as far as the U.S. politics is concerned, I would say the U.S. lens is concerned. One of the departures we see, and this is happening, U.S. was watching with the Millennium Challenge Corporation a grant of half $1 billion, and this was the first tranche, and it could grow. This was a test case, perhaps, to see whether the U.S. can engage with Nepal directly. There were a lot of issues. I mean, we had, this was the first time Chinese propaganda machinery really got active on the ground to create a lot of misleading statements and issues around the MCC. But I think we got over it, the parliament approved it, and that has given US sort of ammunition to come forward. Also, Nepal was looked from by US through the lens of India. And now I think it wants to form its own narrative, and the way the embassy is being equipped now, way additional people are being recruited within the embassy, and the engagement, we do see this. And also, it is also looking at from the perspective that, especially on hydropower, now with 10,000 megawatts. Now earlier we were talking about, literally, I mean, I remember doing the first US investment was 36 megawatts we did on the ground with a Texas-based energy company. So now we are talking about big projects. So energy is of interest for the US, and especially, and markets that are there in India and in Bangladesh. And also we've seen that there has been increased US investments in the region the last couple of years. We've seen Bangladesh. Sri Lanka is unfortunately, there was a break, but we've seen in Bangladesh, especially interests of US companies. So there is, say, the American Chamber of Commerce is being established in Nepal. So there is this, in our discussions there's more hope for more US engagements in terms of projects, be it in the financial services sector, be it in the automobile sector. So that is pushing US to change from being dependent on India to look at Nepal. So that's that. As far as the Agni's the scheme, the recruitment scheme goes, one of the fundamental changes that have happened in Nepal is that the opportunities that have opened up in for young people in Nepal, and you look at today, UAE is about 500,000 people. Look at Malaysia, now Korea, Japan is opening up. Seasonal workers in UK is opening up. So, joining Indian Army is not one of the preferred, preferred career choices anymore. That is one. So there is, as you said, there are lots of statements and all coming up, but then if you look at the intake, there is not much of enthusiasm. British Gurkha, yes, because of the money and the opportunity to get UK citizenship once you, retire. But, with India, that's been one of the challenges that we see. The other is that while the reality may be different, the perception on the ground is that the post-retirement benefits have reduced dramatically. So there's, earlier people you say you just get your pensions, so it was, employment for life. And so that has changed. So you don't have that sort of thing. And the biggest thing that has changed is that earlier people, and especially because, as I said, we work with the Army Welfare Fund in Nepal side, so we do, comparative research of welfare schemes in India. Earlier, the life expectancy was about 55. That's how this whole programs are designed around. So, for instance, now welfare schemes are costing everybody dear because people are living 9,500. So the welfare schemes were never designed for that. And people thought that, okay, at 35, 40, they retire, and then so now people think their expectancy is 75, 80. So their career choices they have to make are far different. And so joining Indian Army, be the temporary schemes or the the long-term schemes, are not as much attractive. Yeah. Hopefully answers the question. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Thanks, Ajit, for the interesting. Thanks, Ajit, for the interesting overview of the socio-economic and political milieu in Nepal. Just as you were talking about the elections, I'm going to ask two very quick related questions about the results of the elections. The first being, what sense do you get about the mood among the people of Nepal with regards to the political process? And I ask that primarily because we know that the voter turnout decreased this time now in the elections, but there was also a lot of the sitting members of parliament lost their seats, but yet the same parties are primarily jostling for power again. So how do people feel about the political process? And secondly, related to that is, what's your prediction about the future of this current coalition government? I know that's a bit unfair, but...
The first, I think the first one is, as I was mentioning, we knew that the status quo had to be challenged, and it has been challenged. And I look at this very positively from a personal perspective, because in Unleashing the Vajra, I talk about the situation like this only happening in the 2027 elections. So it has happened 5 years earlier. So I'm super happy. No, it's not being satisfied with what's happened, but in terms of the questioning of the way voters question, the way the independent candidates won. Also, the benefit of having this elections where you have direct elected representatives and the first past the post and proportional representation. So this is so important. It just balances out a lot. It forced women candidates to be brought in, which in the first 2018 elections, it was just done to tick the boxes. But this time, more thought had been put in. So that way, we see dislodgement of some of the existing political leaders. But at the same time, we were not expecting any changes to happen. So if you look at, most of the people were predicting something like this. One of these guys, becoming the prime minister, it would have been too far asked for this, 5 or 6 of these guys to actually lose elections, so that's there. But in terms of the voters turnout, 2 things. One is that Nepalis outside, who live outside Nepal are not allowed to vote. And that's a significant population. So we have about 5 million. And these are generally, people who would have been eligible voters who are not there. So people who not fly in from UK, Dubai or Qatar or something. So if you allow posted ballots, definitely that would go up dramatically. And also we saw that the local elections saw a better turnout. And it's also that's something that people saw tangibly happening, something that's happening close to your, close to your home turf, and vis-a-vis electing somebody to Kathmandu, and it's at the end of the same guys, even whatever we do. So we see, results of some of the local elections. It's been, there's more voter turnout, and also in areas where there have been independent candidates, we've seen larger voter turnout than in areas where the existing, say, the prime ministers and all ran. But we need to also understand, like for instance, the incumbent, a former prime minister in Dioba's constituency, a young guy from another, district, Sagar Dakal, comes in and he garners nearly half the votes, and which also shows that there is a strong undercurrent of questioning status quo. As far as the second part goes, of course, we do this for a living. In terms of predicting, we would see that there are, the presidential elections that are going to happen is going to determine whether this coalition is going to survive or not. If the UML candidate for president will be voted to be the president, then this would survive, and there would be some changes. But if a Congress and Maoist candidate for president actually wins, then this coalition is gone. Then we will, we'll see another coalition being formed. But also the new constitution does anticipate these changes, so it does not allow immediately changes to be made. So you can't just split parties, you can't do so many things now, which you could do with the old constitution. So it's the key is that the key date would be the presidential election dates, and once that happens, we can see. But then it's going to be one of these guys becoming the prime minister, and one of these parties leading it. I mean, it's very funny when the no confidence motion got to vote. Out of 270, there were only 2 in the opposition. 268 voted for the motion. So it's a very unique that way also, that everybody. It's about, again, power grab. It doesn't have ideology. It's all about staying in power. It's perpetuating your perpetuating power and money through building different partnerships. And again, we have to always remember that in the past 15 years, we've seen all the permutation combinations of all kinds in Nepal. So we've experimented with everything also. So it also shows that uncertainty is the only constant as far as Nepal is concerned.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. So I just want to hear your thoughts more about the MCC compact. So you mentioned that it was, a matter of political controversy, and it was like China really got their propaganda machine there. Now, almost a year after the parliament passed it, what is the public sentiment over it like? Because even the public was pretty divided on the MCC. Do people now view it as an investment opportunity, or are there other concerns? Is whether political or environmental. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
The way we see is that if we step back and look at how stories become viral and how it is discussed, there are two elements as far as Nepal is concerned we need to be, sort of mindful. One is that Nepalis love politics. I mean, we just, you can leave Nepal, but you'll not leave politics. I mean, if you're in the diaspora, everywhere, people love this. So the discussions keep happening. But also, if we look at the MCC discourse, flared up because of social media, the proliferation also. So if it was 15 years ago, I don't think this much of discussions would happen. And this is a time when a kid being rescued out of a well, people can spend 4 days looking at it, So that's the world we live in, So this is a political issue. So, I mean, people get interested. So today it's MCC, tomorrow it's something else, it's like, watching a soap opera, you have new characters coming in and it just moves on. So there is the deep divide we need to understand is that the communists that a bulk of them rule are in the government here. Maoists were completely anti-US. Let's take it from an ideology perspective. They killed people, for being, sort of being affiliated to US, and so the deep, sort of anti-US sentiments that the communists have, that is something we need to consider. So that did complicate the MCC issue. Also, there are, both India and China would not like US to be engaging directly in Nepal. So there were reservations and there were, sort of tacit, direct, indirect opposition to MCC from that perspective. So that also created a lot of fence-sitters to look at where this goes. As far as the MCC itself by design is concerned, and it's a more of a, while it's a US stuff, it is also got a multilateral dimension to it because you have India to agree on a lot of the transmission stuff. So those, I think the MCC has not been explained properly. And that created a lot of problems. And this is my feedback when the MCC vice, president was there. I said, please translate stuff in Nepali, put it up on Nepali, have YouTube channels that would talk about, explain to people what it is, because it was not very well understood. And the draft is it's a strong legal draft in English. And if you produce that in Nepali, so many words can have different connotations in Nepali. So those were issues that we need to continuously look at. So it's not because it's been passed and everybody's agreed and this is moving ahead. It can just, because there are a lot of people in the current coalition, especially the Independent Party, the Royalist Party, they were not favored to this MCC deal. So if they would lead some of these government, this would, again, the controversy would come back. But we see for a country like Nepal, if you would want foreign investments, I look at from those lenses. If you want foreign investments, if you want people to invest in your energy sector, then you need good transmission line, you need energy market. And a grant, a $500 million grant like MCC, helps to create those enabling environment. And so that's where I see the importance. And no, sort of grant or interventions are perfect. But given Nepal's situation, it is, especially in the development of its energy market and hydropower, MCC is a good positive intervention in terms of developing the ecosystem that is required for Nepal's energy market. Hope that answers your question.
Hi, sir. Thank you for your talk. I have 2 questions, and sadly, they are related to China. I hope you don't mind.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so my first question, the background is that we all know China has very strong party-to-party contacts in Nepal, especially in 2019 when we see the symposium on Xi Jinping talk being attended by high-level political leaders. So I was just wondering, how do you perceive this Chinese elite capture of Nepalese elites, like moving forward? And my second question goes to using Buddhism as a soft power cultural asset. So we know that both India and China have been trying to initiate projects surrounding the the birthplace of Buddha. And last year, Modi actually flew directly to Lumbini instead and bypassed the newly built Chinese airport. So some say he was doing it on purpose, and some said, oh, no, security reasons. I mean, I don't know. But in your view, how can Nepal leverage this Buddhism as a diplomacy and soft cultural asset? And also, how does Nepal see itself in between the India and China quest for global leadership?
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, just to be specific, global Buddhist leadership. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
No, thank you for your questions. I think on the first one, when we look at Nepal's relationship with China, we need to look at let's say, two perspectives. One is the historical and one is the cultural. That's what in my writings I do. If you look at historical perspective, China was never Nepal's immediate neighbor. It was Tibet. It's only after 1960 that China became its neighbor. So our deep cultural ties, religious ties, was with Tibet. So this is China as we are just learning. And also for Beijing, it was a place that was far off there. They said, okay, let you guys handle with India. So the historical perspective is very important, that China and Nepal never had a shared relationship that it can work on. So it's unlike with India. Okay? And the second is the cultural part is that I always say that when a Nepali wedding happens, if people start dancing to Chinese songs and start wearing Chinese costumes and start mimicking Chinese soap operas and television shows, then I know Chinese influences in Nepal. That's what I say. Culturally, we are very deeply tied to sort of the larger South Asian civilization. So if you look at from whether it be the food, whether it be our rituals, whether it be their influences, so that's very strong. So that we do not see changing in at least years to come. As I said, this fundamentals of culture. So from that perspective, the influences would happen. Also again, I look from an economic perspective. We don't see the large Chinese investors in Nepal coming in, like we see in Africa or in Cambodia and Laos in our work. We don't see those big companies. It's like generally, firms from Kunming or firms from Lhasa wanting to do mom and pop operations. There are one or two major hydropower energy companies that are coming in. We are not seeing the sort of the Chinese investments that we see in other parts coming in India, coming in Nepal. So I see it's more of personality driven. So say the head of the Tibet Autonomous Region comes to Nepal, he is very well welcome, he loves it. He goes to Beijing, he's nobody. But in Kathmandu, he's somebody. So, so we see those type of relationship. The second part on the Buddhism part, that's of my personal interest also. And I've written a piece called, I think I share with you, is called Buddhism as a Connector. So for Nepal, it's the opportunity is to leverage Buddhism not only from the perspective of Lumbini also the lot of intangible heritage that exists around Buddhism in Nepal. Yes, that space is contested very strongly now between India and China, especially after the last, the Communist Party, the big convention in October. We are seeing more, the messages of more engagement in that area. Of course, China wanted to build something in Lumbini, and that was stalled, but we would see this happening in the future. So for Nepal, it is to figure out how it can balance this. It's not easy, but India is building up this Buddhist circuit. China is very keen to bring back, as Xi Jinping says, that there's having 8 Rolls-Royce in your in your garage is not going to make you happy. So there is that sense of a lot of movements we see. Like yesterday also when I was flying into Bangkok, a lot of pilgrims coming in and coming in from Lumbini. So that's a huge thing that we would see. And I would say that we need to play it in a positive frame to bring back a lot of archiving, a lot of intangible heritage, excavating of heritage sites, building up museums. So that's where some of collaborative work can also happen, rather than, again, turning this into a geopolitical rivalry. I think that is where I've been continuously, sort of pushing for Nepal to take a role where it encourages all this for the larger good rather than make the two countries compete on this.
I'm Tarek from Bangladesh, and I've followed your remarks with great interest. 3 questions. One, basically a corollary flowing from Iqbal's question on the nature of the coalition government. Is it going to survive? What's going to happen? And your response that it depends on who will be the next president. So that makes it a very iffy situation. And where the coalition government will actually end up, my interest is how is it going to impact, you mentioned 2 things in your talk, the BBIN and power connectivity with Bangladesh and India. Both have been sort of on again, off again. It's been a roller coaster ride for the last 8, 10 years since I initiated it from India. How is it going to affect both of these? Coalition governments per se are not necessarily bad. In fact, 2 coalition governments at the same time in Bangladesh and India basically made the breakthrough happen in 1996. Otherwise, it would not have been happened. It was highly polarized. And then one coalition government in India, following on what it had achieved, could not ratify important agreements with Bangladesh. So a majoritarian government came in and ratified it. So, this is a complex question given our complex history. But the regional cooperation agenda sometimes gets mired in and stuck in this political process which does a ding-dong sort of act continuously. Where do you see this?
I think first part of your question on nature of coalition, I've been always talking about how for the past 70 years, from 1950, 73 years, Nepal has been constantly under political uncertainty. Even during the most certain days of the kings, 30 years of the Panchayat, as we call it, the single party, there was no certainty. There was, uncertainty has been the constant. And Nepalis per se, they have very little expectations from the government. That's why the country keeps moving. So irrespective of, when I was doing the hydropower project, I saw through 6 governments. In the project, some of the projects I do have seen through 5, 6, 7 governments. So we don't really care. It just needs to move, because that's how the nature of the country we see happening. So no dramatic policy changes we see, which leads to the second issue on BBIN. Like in the past 7 years, I think I've worked with 8, 10 ministers and 4, 5 prime ministers on the BBIN thing. We go in. We are yet to hear anyone being against it, because everybody realizes that given Nepal's location in between India and China, and being next to a very big India, the only way it can move ahead is to find alliances in Bhutan, in Bangladesh, and especially with the land link connectivity and the opportunity on the energy side. That is every person. I'm yet to meet anyone who is against this. Nepal was also a big proponent of SAARC. That's why the headquarters is there. Nepal was pushing SAARC a lot, but it just got stuck. So everybody sees this as an opportunity. So I don't see anything background. As far as the power connectivity and energy is concerned, again, we see a very unified voice. It's only that some people would prefer Chinese investments to Indian, or somebody would say Indian to Chinese. But it's about leveraging both the countries to develop your hydropower resources that we see. And where do you sell it? You sell it to India, you sell it to Bangladesh. So that is understood, and everybody understands where the challenges are, and currently where it is stuck. It's not stuck in Nepal, it's stuck in India in terms of the, the power trade issue, and including trade with Bangladesh is concerned. So I don't see the changes in government or the actors would anyway impact BBIN or energy trade, energy development of energy markets, because everybody sees this as the opportunity for Nepal. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your very interesting talk. I had a question regarding hydropower as well. I'll bring the conversation back to it. So naturally, there is a major recognition that there is a lot of potential in Nepal to produce and export hydrogen. And to that effect, there will naturally be a lot of hydropower projects which are currently in the pipeline or being planned. My question was that now dams are moving more and more upstream, considering all the ideal places in dams are already constructed, so now they're moving upstream. And naturally, because of global warming and climate change, the glaciers are now melting at a much faster pace, and there's a lot of uncertainty as to how that sort of interacts with how the ecology of the region will work. So to that effect, in India in 2021 we saw when in Uttarakhand where there was a flash flood which washed away a hydropower project and severely impacted another one. So how do you think that has translated into policy, and how that has basically interacted with Nepal's policy on hydropower projects going forward, if that has had any effect?
Definitely policymakers are thinking of it, and we have been having a lot of dialogues on this, and especially after what's happening on, say, 25 years ago, climate change would not be a risk factor we would plug in when you are doing assessment. You do an EIA, and from your traditional ways, you do your environmental impact assessment, and you say that this is okay. Which means that you have to also push for innovation. So we've been looking at, this is about 10 days ago, we were having a meet in Nepal on this issue, and that's why the Himalaya Future Forum and the work we do on circular economy becomes very important in the sense to explore these issues. One is through innovation, so you can have pump storage. So in the US and places like Montana, you have these pump storage where you can pump the same water, so hydropower gives you the peak energy, the others can. So it's about developing an energy market for it. Also leveraging solar, that's becoming big. You can always have solar that plays back to your grid. So you are looking at hydropower development through multiple lenses now. That's the climate change impact is there. The third thing that which we are now, that's why for the Future Forum we want to work around innovation and data and digital transformation, because earlier, like my friends who are in this sector and tell me, like earlier you could have a flash flood would happen once in 150 years, 200 years. Now it's happening in 20 years. So like when the first hydropower project I was doing, we got hit by a flood. I was involved in it. And so we were taking data, it was a 150-year flood cycle. But it started happening very often. So, and you have like earthquake was never considered a big issue. And we now realize that for Nepal hydropower projects, we can't find any insurance for earthquake in the global market. That's a huge thing. So that has impacted financing costs. So with the British International Investment, BII, we were discussing this, and it said, okay, now what do you do? Now, how big is your project going to be? And how much, so are we going to look at captive insurance to address this? Because we are not being able to find earthquake-related insurance products in the international markets, which is a huge risk. So these are new risks that are coming up in hydropower development, and it's about figuring out how you're going to mitigate. Maybe the size issue. Also, because of the rainfall, what we call is, Nepal's hydropower is also very peculiar because you have a lot of water for a couple of months. Peak production, and like during the dry months, it's like you literally shut down your plants. So you build up for a level that you are using only for 4 months of the year. So how do you make optimum investment? So these are discussions that are happening, but as I mentioned earlier the discourse was around being energy hungry and immediately needing hydropower plants to provide supply to take care of your electricity deficit. But now you're talking about going to the markets and as an energy surplus country to sell. And that requires a completely change in mindset to look at, because then the commercials are different because you're not going to get the rates that you used to get earlier on your PPAs. Then how do you make it more efficient? So these are, again, from the commercial side of it, the economic cost of it, and again, impact of climate change, these need to be looked into.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Paras Ratna. I am doing PhD here at the South Asian Studies Department. I just have one simple question. I was just going through some news report, Kathmandu Post news report, that the government is, whichever comes in power, is going to push through Citizenship Amendment Act that was initially denied by the President Vidya Bhandari. So how do you see, given the FE situation or the topsy-turvy situation of the coalition politics, how do you see this spanning out, and will it have any bilateral implications vis-a-vis India? Thank you.
Good question. We can have a full session on this, but in short, the citizenship issue is something that Nepal needs to address. We went through 10 years of insurgency. There's this Madhes and sort of uprising. All that happened to be able to provide citizenship to people who were denied citizenship. So at some point of time, the public pressure is going to be big enough because elections were done, because also being anti-citizenship bill do get you some votes in the hilly regions, but it's not sustainable. So we would see this getting resolved. The main issue that's coming up, which is the citizenship in the name of the mother, which is still denied, though the Supreme Court has said is allowed, because so that's the issue in the Tarai. We have, say, a Nepali citizen, male, a Nepali citizen female marrying an Indian citizen male, their children not getting Nepali citizenship, especially in the Madhes, that's the big issue. And but as more women are coming into the workforce, as more women professional in professions and other areas are coming in, and as marriages are taking place outside Nepal, in different countries, and also the rights to property. So there are a lot of these layered issues that would only force, it's only a matter of time, I see, whether, there can be opposition on this, but getting political mileage out of stopping the citizenship bill, compared to 10 years ago, it's reduced dramatically, and I don't think this is sustainable. So it's only, I personally see it as a matter of time. There are contesting views on it, of course. That's my personal view, I'd say.
Thank you so much for the talk. You covered so much in that half an hour. I kind of wanted to ask a historical question. You talked about the dynamics of party politics and convenience over ideology, and that no legislation has passed for such a long time. I wanted to ask about sort of the 10-year period that took to write the Constitution. What sort of issues that caused that delay, the stalemates? You touched on issues of inclusion as well as the diversity in language. So I kind of want to also build on that and say, does the new constitution spell out kind of an ideology for the state, and does that have a role in the way in which the politics of convenience play out in Parliament and in Nepal generally? Thank you.
Thank you. So if we go back 2006, when the second Jan Andolan, or the popular uprising, took place, and it was basically to overthrow the 240-year monarchy. And what are the fundamental three things that you had issues against? Was against Nepal being a Hindu kingdom. So you fought for secularism, so because of ethnic inclusion. The second was about unitary government, everything being managed through Kathmandu. Instead of that, you wanted, devolution of power to local levels. So that was the second thing you fought. And the third, you fought first for citizenship, to all the people who are denied citizenship to get in. So ideologically, everything sounded very well. But as the constitution writing began, that's what I've noticed and have been written. One was that the Constituent Assembly time was when all the parties were together, and I call it the APM, the all-party mechanism, and that began. And people were very happy to form a coalition of consensus and, sort of not allow a new constitution to come in. Everybody benefited when there was no constitution, at least the political elite. It was a great time for them. They could get projects approved. They could get so many things just, 8 people sitting in the room or 6 leaders sitting in the room. They could get a lot of decisions done. So that's why the constitution, and we had two constituent assemblies. And if it was not for the earthquake, this constitution wouldn't have been written in September, but it wouldn't have been promulgated in September 2015. It was earthquake, April 2015, when the young people, came up, and then that's when the political parties said, no, guys, let's get together, let's finish this job, let's write the constitution. It just happened hurriedly. That's why there were a lot of issues on the citizenship issue that was not included, and that created a huge problem with India. So the issues that for which the new constitution was written, devolution of power, people, when it started getting acted upon, people are not liking it. Where, there are people who are in provincial assembly contesting as mayors. So you can imagine, sort of the local bodies becoming more powerful than the parliamentarians and the assembly members in the provincial, assembly. So, which is not something that people love, because let's not forget that societally we are from a very conservative, because of our, sort of the Hindu structure, we are very patriarchal. And it's always, experience over merit. And so if you're from an older generation, you sit in Kathmandu, you think you can control everything, and that was being questioned. You had younger leaders coming in from different parts. So that is where the conflict began and still continues. So because the people who really wanted the constitution to be written, I mean, look at the Maoist leaders today, the people who fought 10 years of insurgency. Do you think, they've just justified the cause they fought for? 14,000 lives were lost. So it's some deeper introspection is required, and it's very clear that politics has been in Nepal about for convenience, and sort of 4 or 5 people ganging up together and sort of making new rules, like you do it for many institution organizations. So does that answer your question? Okay.
Anyone else?
So can I just add to was there much in the way of to constitution making in other parts of the world? Was there a migration of ideas in post-conflict setting? Sorry, I just finished my question.
Yeah, I think there is, and this is where also some of the complications came in. So if you look at multiple, Nepal that way has a very good goodwill. So when be it for the constitution writing due to earthquake or COVID, we get a lot of support from different international players. But so if you look at, but then that also complicates it. So you had the Swiss thinking of federations, whereas your houses were being built around committees that work in the US. Your Truth and Reconciliation committees were being formed on how it happened in South Africa. So there's been a mix of a lot of things, and that also has created some of these challenges. It's not that we didn't look up to some of the other constitutions, that were being written, and we did look at. But then there were plethora of players, and then there was a UN-led. There was a peacekeeping mission, and then the UN-led constitution writing. So it's all about who influenced those processes, and not in a negative way, because like I remember the German ambassador telling me that, okay, here is it, a constitution doesn't have to be big, it can just be a few pages, you don't need a big insert. So somebody says, no, you need a, so we got so many ideas and suggestions, and in trying to, figure out what is best for us, I think we picked up pieces from a lot of places, and that's where also some of the challenges with the constitution is there. In the spirit part of it, you are very influenced by the Indian Constitution, the way it has been written. Also the way the socialist, secular, that's a lot comes from the Indian Constitution side. But the devolution of power is very much Swiss-oriented. The House committees, as I said, is US-oriented. So there's multiple ways in which the Constitution came in. So that also has created, and we didn't have the time to, again, going back 2015, this was done so much in a hurry. We didn't have time to sit down and say, okay, we should be reviewing it. And it has never been reviewed. And Constitution is not a sacrosanct document, and that's what we've been pushing for, is that time for another look at it, time for an amendment, and it's not carved in stone. We need to, pluck out areas that don't, that doesn't work well, and then, amend accordingly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your talk and the questions. They've been quite enlightening. I just have one question which looks at, so in South Asia, we see that there is competition for the position of net security provider and in extension also net aid and development. It's a competition between India and China, broadly speaking. How do you see Nepal sort of taking the mid path, if I may say so, in terms of balancing, especially because each time there is talk of infrastructural cooperation with either of the two states, there is some sort of domestic backlash. To a certain extent, it could be the heightening effect of social media, but there is still certain domestic discords because of the coalition and different parties sort of focusing on different intentions out of it. How do you think Nepal, in terms of its policy, is trying to take a balanced approach in terms of heightening security concerns in the region? And that would, thank you.
No, thank you. In terms of India, China, of course, Nepal is landing to both have interest in it. But we need to also look at some of the historical perspectives. So when 1950, I always, like in my book, I talk about how while India and China both were aid recipients, they competed to be aid, providers. In even way back in 1950, competed to build roads because you always thought aid was also a way to influence government. But then we always say that, I think this has been in all platforms I've been talking both sides, to say that stop and introspect. What are you giving? One is that both India and China, the aid they provide, it is not through the government. It is, all the other aid is through development partners. They have a coalition, there's a government. So India and China is never part of, so there's to a certain degree of independence in terms of what they provide. And that is always, both countries are linked to, geopolitical issues. So that, the accountability issue is a big problem, both Indian aid as well as the Chinese aid in Nepal. So that's one thing we need to understand. Also, in terms of the quantum, both what India, just the Indian budget, if you see, it's nothing what you're providing. If you look at, for a $4 billion economy in 1990, say $50 million would be a big thing. But today, for a $40 billion economy, $100 million is not, it's on the wrong side of the decimal, I say. So if you really want to influence, there has to be a lot more being pumped in by both countries. I think that's how I see it. So it's just become, a small change. I've been very openly talking about it. I remember when Prime Minister Modi visited Janakpur and made this statement, I'm going to give 100 crores, and I just immediately tweeted to say that's a small plot of land in Dararmag in Kathmandu. 100 crores doesn't buy you that much. So what are you talking about? So it's about the quantum of aid, and this is where the introspection on both countries are required. They think by just providing $10-15 million that you can influence policy, influence projects. No, now each of the hydropower projects are coming up as $1 billion, $1.5 billion projects. So Exim Bank of India wields more power through its $2 billion, sort of lending than the aid, that's provided by government of India. So you have to find investments, trade, to replace your traditional ways of thinking that by providing a few million, I would be able to sort of have a good impression in this country or sort of earn some brownie points. Hope that answers your question.
So talking about the inflation, before elections we found that the inflation rate was very high in Nepal. So how the Prachanda government is taking steps to control inflation and manage economy?
I always, hopefully he knows there's inflation. That's the state we are in. So I don't think it's a government has to, when it comes to inflation and other issues, we need to always remember that our currency is pegged to the Indian rupee. So if India sneezes, Nepal catches a cold. So if there's inflation in India, we get it 1.6 times. So that's one you need to look at. There has been liquidity crisis. There were, post the impact of COVID did impact economic activities, but we're seeing good recovery, as I was saying earlier. Balance of payment is increasing, foreign reserves are increasing, and we see that inflation itself is controlled to a large extent than earlier. And again, it stems from what's happening in India. The last couple of months of Indian economy has been strong, and that we see. And it's, again, when we are talking about inflation, it's basic products, it's food products, it's about construction materials, it's about basic stuff. And much of that is either produced in India or comes through India. So we see that.
Going to visit first?
Yeah?
Which capital he is going to visit first?
Let's see. Let him stay there and we can talk about it. He should be there to visit.
Maybe I'll just ask just a follow-up quick question on, you mentioned energy and hydro projects, and there was a question about that as well. Quick follow-up, we know there's a fair amount of investment. There's a fair amount of investment on hydro projects. Is there, and there's been talk about green hydrogen, but is there a potential of developing a sort of strategy towards moving towards green hydrogen?
The discussions have begun. It's at a very nascent stage. There was a meet, I think it was in October, in Nepal, just after, when you came, the next day there was this discussions that were happening. The discussions have begun, but it's also, I think, globally at a very nascent stage in terms of their technology, in terms of looking at what are the impacts and what are the costs, and how do you commercially securitize transactions around it. So to that extent, it's open, but then definitely there are hydro developers and people in the energy sector do see this as the next stage of moving towards developing green hydrogen projects, also on solar solutions, and also on energy efficiency solutions, not only on green hydrogen, also like smart cooking and others. So looking at the energy ecosystem and green hydrogen part of it